Okay, so welcome to the second half of Chapter 23 video lecture for Music History 2. This part of the chapter is on Mozart, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Mozart lived from 1756 to 1791. There are not a lot of dates that I think it's important that you have memorized, but the most famous composers, I think it is a good thing for you to memorize these dates. So Mozart, 1756 1791, died when he was 35 years old. Is considered to be one of the greatest composers of classical music, Western art music, if not maybe the greatest, certainly one of the most talented and productive composers who's ever lived. He was born in Salzburg in Austria. He was the son of Leopold Mozart, who was a professional musician, and who was his teacher, his primary teacher. He toured Europe, and we're going to kind of hit into more details about all these things. It's just kind of a quick overview. He toured Europe with his father and his sister, Maria Anna, both of whom were actually very talented musicians, but society being what it was at the time, it was not felt that a woman should become a professional musician, and so Maria Anna just got married and moved on with her life, whereas Wolfgang, of course, became one of the most famous musicians of all time. Just kind of hit the highlights here. After he got off tour, touring around Europe, he served as a musician in the court of the Archbishop of Salzburg, where his father worked, for a number of years. Then when he was 25, he moved to Vienna, which was the musical capital of Europe. Everyone went to Vienna. Haydn moved to Vienna, Mozart moved to Vienna, Beethoven moved to Vienna, Schubert was born in Vienna. So during this period of time, Vienna was absolutely the musical capital of Europe. He was a freelance musician for 10 years in Vienna. Initially quite successful, eventually not quite so successful. In 1782, he got married. His father didn't want him to get married to Constanze Weber, but they did. And they had, I don't remember if it was either 6 or 8 children, all of whom died in their infancy except for 2 sons. These 2 sons did live to adulthood, one of whom became a professional musician, the other of whom studied law, although I think he was also involved in music. Interestingly to me, neither of those sons had children, so the direct line to Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart died out in the middle of the 1800s. So there's no one that can trace their lineage directly back to Mozart. When he was a freelance musician, he got his income the same way that all freelance musicians would get their income, by performing his works for the wealthy. They would pay him to come in and perform and stage performances. Also, he would stage public performances of his works. He would publish music so it could be sold and he could collect royalties from that. And he would also teach. So these are the major income streams that supported Mozart once he moved to Vienna. He left behind, he only lived to be 35 years old, he left behind over 600 compositions. They were cataloged by a German named Ludwig Kerschel. They were cataloged in 1862, I believe. Yeah, 1862, it's right there. This is why when you see a piece of music by Mozart, it has a K number on it for Kerschel, either K or KV. V is the German for catalog. It starts with V, so KV means Kerschel catalog. So when you see a Mozart piece, they always have these K numbers, and that tells you what order they were composed in. Now, well, actually, I'll go ahead and hit this right now. His major works. He wrote 20 operas. He wrote 17 masses, Catholic masses. Austria was Catholic. Mozart was born in Austria. He was Catholic, was raised Catholic, was a devout Catholic his whole life. As I said, both his father and himself worked for the Archbishop of Salzburg, who is a very, very important member of the Catholic Church. He wrote a Requiem Mass. He actually died while he was composing his Requiem. It was not finished. It has since been completed by multiple different people. 55 symphonies. Now this is an interesting number. The Kerschel catalog, as I alluded to earlier, only has 41 symphonies in it. After the Kerschel catalog came out, later research actually showed that he may have composed as many as 55 symphonies. Quite a few pieces of music by Mozart were discovered or attributed to him after the Kerschel catalog came out. So the last piece of music, according to Kerschel, that Mozart wrote was K626, his Requiem. However, it turns out he probably wrote in excess of 700 pieces of music. It's just those are the ones that are in the catalog. So if someone asks you, or if it's on an exam, how many symphonies did Mozart write, the accepted answer is actually 41. Those 41 are in the Kerschel catalog, not 55. 23 piano concertos, again, he probably wrote 27, although some of those concerti were concerti for multiple pianos or arrangements. So he wrote 23 solo piano concertos, 15 other concerti, 4 French horn concertos, a bassoon concerto, a flute concerto, clarinet concerto, etc. 26 string quartets, 19 piano sonatas, and many other works. It's important to understand that Mozart's music is in the standard core repertoire for everyone. If you're a Western classical musician and Mozart wrote a piece, that's a piece that you probably should know and that people are going to expect to hear you perform. Even the stuff Mozart wrote when he was young gets performed every now and again. And certainly all of his mature works are in the absolute heart of the classical repertoire. All right, now let's get into some details. He was a child prodigy. His father, Leopold Mozart, was the Kapellmeister for the Archbishop of Salzburg. That means he was the head of the orchestra. He was also a violinist. In his time, he was a very respected composer. Of course, his son has far eclipsed his father, but in his father's time, he was a highly respected musician who wrote a book about playing the violin in 1756, which even today is considered to be a very valuable book. So, Leopold Mozart, he was no slouch himself. Mozart was Wolfgang Mozart, even at a young age, was a keyboard virtuoso, also became a talented violinist. So, as I said, when he was 6 years old, his father took Wolfgang and his sister on tour. And they toured across Europe for around the next 9 years until Mozart was around 15, performing for the wealthy, staging public concerts, performing for members of the royalty and nobility. He even had a command performance for the Pope. He showed the same kind of precocious behavior in his composing as in his performing. He wrote the earliest pieces we know that he wrote when he was 5 years old, when he wrote some minuets. When he was 8 years old, he wrote his first symphony that we know of. He wrote an oratorio when he was 11. When he was 12 years old, he wrote his first complete opera, which is mind-boggling if you think about it. Opera being such a complex form of music, you're dealing with instruments, you're dealing with solo voices, you're dealing with choruses, you're dealing with text, you're dealing with staging, you're dealing with... It's probably about the most complex form that a composer can approach, and Mozart wrote his first opera when he was 12 years old. This touring actually took him to a lot of countries, which introduced him to a lot of different styles of music, which kind of makes Mozart's music unique in that the way he adapted all of these different styles. Who were some of these influences? Well, there was a composer, not really known today, named Johann Schobert, not Schubert, that he came later, Johann Schobert, who was an early influence on Mozart. Schobert was best known for his harpsichord compositions, where he would kind of write very full textures for the harpsichord, imitating orchestral pieces. J.C. Bach, who we've talked about, Johann Christian Bach, who was known as London Bach, was a big influence on Mozart as well. From J.C. Bach, he kind of got the influence of these very lyrical, tuneful melodies, influenced by Italian opera. Also, his tendency at times to employ chromaticism and kind of go away from the very clearly delineated chord progressions that we hear in a lot of classical music. Mozart was a little more adventuresome in that. He traveled to Italy on multiple occasions, where he actually took some lessons with a very well-known musician and teacher in Bologna named Padre Martini, member of the Catholic Church. He studied counterpoint with Padre Martini. He also showed the influence of Sammartini. If you remember, Sammartini is one of, if not the earliest composer of symphonies. Finally, he was influenced by the music that was going on in Vienna. Even before he moved to Vienna, Vienna was the musical capital of the world, and so symphonies, string quartets, and serenades were kind of the main forms of instrumental music being composed in Vienna, and Mozart showed the influence of these Viennese styles as well. It's a picture, it's in your book, of the Mozarts on tour. There's Wolfgang at the piano, Maria Anna singing, and Father Leopold playing violin. So, because of the fact that in this time it was very difficult for a musician to make a living as a freelance musician. They all sought out patronage. They all sought to work for members of the nobility or for the church. So when he was 15 years old, 16 years old, Mozart went to work at the Archbishop of Salzburg's court, the same court where his father worked. He served there for 8 years as a third concertmaster, third leader of the orchestra. It was an unpaid position. The problem that Mozart really struggled with here was that from ages 6 to 15, he was treated as a rock star. He toured around Europe playing for all these very important people who treated him like an equal. They showered him with praise and they gave him gifts. And then when he was 16 years old, he became a servant. Because remember, as we discussed in Haydn, the position of a composer during this time was that of a skilled servant. So Mozart went from being a rock star to being treated as a servant. Always struggled with that adjustment. In 1781, when he was 25 years old, Mozart was commissioned to write an opera for the Munich Opera in Germany, Idomeneo, which was probably his greatest opera seria. Most of Mozart's most famous operas are considered to be comic operas, be they Singspiels or opera buffa. So the success of Idomeneo actually encouraged him to leave the Archbishop's court and move to Vienna and try and make it as a freelance musician. His first major success in Vienna was a Singspiel, a comic opera in German, titled The Abduction from the Seraglio. It was produced in 1782. It was a huge success. He got students. He taught amateur pianists and composers, mainly children of the wealthy, who paid him well to do this. He staged private performances for wealthy people who paid him to come in and play for them and their friends. Also public performances where he would organize his own concerts and perform his own music, sell tickets to that. He wrote many compositions during his time in Vienna, of course, some of which were commissions. In other words, someone paid him money to compose this piece of music, other of which he composed to publish himself. If you compose something on commission, just like if you're a visual artist and someone commissions you for a painting, they give you money, you paint a painting, and then they own that painting. So if someone has commissioned a piece of music for Mozart in this time, he didn't necessarily own the rights to publish that music. But other music he wrote specifically to publish, to sell. Eventually, he did get a position with the Emperor Joseph II as his chamber music composer. While in Vienna, Mozart really came to his mature musical style. He had some new influences in Vienna. First of all, he got to know Haydn. Now, Haydn was quite a bit older than Mozart, 24 years older than Mozart, but they actually became friends. They had a very, very friendly relationship, and this led Mozart to study Haydn's music and be influenced by Haydn. Also, another person Mozart got to know was the Baron Gottfried von Swieten. Now, von Swieten was a musician, a member of the nobility, who's actually an incredibly important influence on the classical era. He introduced Mozart to the music of both Johann Sebastian Bach and Handel, two Baroque composers that von Swieten was familiar with. So this influence, actually, we can see as we trace his later compositions, you can see the influence of this music in Mozart's later compositions. Von Swieten also was actually friends with Haydn, and he's the one who wrote the German language libretti for Haydn's two oratorios, the Seasons and the Creation. So he was a very, very important musical figure in the classical era. So let's kind of talk very briefly about the kinds of music that Mozart wrote. Piano music. He basically wrote two different kinds of piano music. He wrote shorter pieces, sonatas, fantasias, rondos, themes and variations, and duets. Most of this was written for people to study or to perform at home. So this was written to be published and to appeal to an amateur audience. These kinds of pieces tend to be a little easier, more accessible to students and amateur performers, so that they will go and buy the publication and Mozart will get his royalties. Other things that Mozart wrote were piano concertos. He wrote 23 piano concertos. Oh, we will break down and do some study of his sonata in F major, K332. Well, we'll get to his concerti in a minute. I don't want to go too far off track here. In the world of chamber music, Mozart wrote string quartets, wrote 26 string quartets, 16 of them when he was young. And believe me, these are in the core of the string quartet repertoire. If you're a member of a string quartet, you played Mozart quartets, period. In 1785, he actually published a set of 6, which are labeled Opus 10. Remember, opus numbers are affixed to publications in order of publication. So Mozart's Opus 10, that was the 10th publication that he released a few years after he came to Vienna. But actually, in the Kerschel catalog, they're well into the Kerschel catalog. I think in the 400s or 500s in the Kerschel catalog. These were dedicated to Haydn because of his friendship with Haydn and Haydn's influence, so they've been nicknamed the Haydn quartets. And they actually show the influence of Haydn's string quartets. More counterpoint, more development. There just tend to be a little more depth of music to them than in his earlier quartets. He also wrote a couple of string quintets, obviously for 5-string players. Everything that Mozart wrote in the chamber music venue is in the standard rep. The quintet for piano and winds, for woodwind instruments and piano. 3 flute quartets for flute and strings. Oboe quartet for solo oboe and strings. Horn quintet, horn and strings again. All of these, the clarinet quintet, they are all in the standard core repertoire. They get played constantly. Serenades and divertimentos. Now, these were pieces of music, suites of music that were composed to be the background entertainment music for parties, for members of the Viennese nobility. I found it to be kind of amusing that this music was written to be popular music, to be played as background music at parties, and today, starting in the 1800s, but today, performances of Mozart's serenades, they're performed in concert halls to hundreds or thousands of people, and you sit down quietly and you enjoy the music. That's kind of the shift in classical music from being popular music to being formal music. The most familiar serenade that he wrote is titled Eine kleine Nachtmusik, which translates as a little night music. I could literally play the first measure of Eine kleine Nachtmusik for you, and you will know the piece. You'll know exactly what I'm talking about if you don't already recognize that name. Now, follow up his concerti. Mozart, as I said, wrote 27 piano concertos. That includes early arrangements and a couple concerti he wrote for multiple pianos. He wrote a concerto for 3 pianos, for example. But he wrote 23 solo piano concertos. So if someone asks you, how many piano concerti did Mozart write? The accepted answer is 23. These were much more difficult than most of the other piano that he wrote, music that he wrote. He wrote them, he gave the world premiere performance of all of them. He wrote them to perform in public, to be a show-off, basically, to show people what a great pianist he was. So they are more difficult than his, the other solo pieces that he wrote, which were intended for publication. And if we have time in class, we will break down Mozart piano concerto. Symphonies. Already said this. The original catalog had 41 symphonies in it, although he may have written as many as 55. Mozart symphonies, again, in the core repertoire. You can't, you could find an orchestra, you can't throw a brick without hitting a Mozart symphony on their program somewhere over the course of a year or two. His final 6 symphonies, 35 through 41, are considered to be his most mature and his greatest symphonies, and they start to show all of these fusions of influences that he had over the years. These later symphonies are more difficult, very challenging, especially for the woodwind performers. They're more complicated contrapuntally, showing the influence of studying the music of Bach and Handel. They're more complicated harmonically, and we're going to break down the Jupiter Symphony, actually, his final symphony, Symphony No. 41. We're going to break down the Jupiter Symphony, and we're going to just see in all of the different movements how he really synthesizes all these things, including a few. Operas. So, as I said, Mozart wrote 20 operas. 10 of them he wrote before the age of 20. His first opera, Buffa, written when he was 12, The Pretend Simpleton. He had 2 commissions before he moved to Vienna. He received 2 commissions from the Munich Opera in in 1775, The Pretend Gardener, which was again an opera buffa, comic opera in Italian, and in 1781, Idomeneo, King of Crete, which is considered by many to be his greatest opera seria. When he moved to Vienna in 1782, he composed The Abduction from the Seraglio, as we talked about. Exoticism is a movement that doesn't really happen until the Romantic era, but exoticism is kind of setting your music in a foreign country, and that was one of the appeals of The Abduction from the Seraglio. While he was in Vienna, he wrote this core of 3 operas, which are maybe the greatest opera trilogy ever written. They're not actually a trilogy because they're not related to each other. But The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and Così fan tutte. They're all in Italian. They're all considered to be opera buffa. However, they also have serious moments in them. All 3 of them, the librettos were by a librettist named Lorenzo da Ponte. So the da Ponte Mozart operas, Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and Così fan tutte, are considered to be, by many, his greatest operas. It's opera buffa, but the characters show more development, more depth. He mixes styles. Don Giovanni is, we're going to spend some time on Don Giovanni in class. It's very funny at times, but it's also very, very serious at times. He really explored social issues. He really explored tension between the classes. The Marriage of Figaro, Figaro is a servant. He actually kind of developed a whole new style of character called a mezzo cattare, or middle character. These are characters that are not just comic relief, or they're not just serious. They have, at various times, comic moments and serious moments. And then he delineated these characters' personalities through the music that he wrote. In the solo arias and recitatives. He's also famous for his ensembles. An ensemble is a generic term in opera for multiple solo voices. So an ensemble can be a duet, a trio, a quartet, a quintet, but has to be solo voices. Once you start getting multiple people on each part, then it's referred to as a chorus. So we are going to spend some time in class with Don Giovanni. His final operas, La Clemenza di Tito, an opera seria in Italian, and The Magic Flute, a Singspiel in German. Now, the interesting thing to me about The Magic Flute, his final opera written in the final year of his life, Mozart was a Freemason. The Masons have been a fraternal organization that stretches back hundreds of years. Many of the so-called founding fathers of America were Freemasons. As a matter of fact, if you look at a dollar bill, or you look at money, you look on the back and you see that pyramid with an eye on the top of it, that's a Masonic symbol. There's a conspiracy theory that says, because in the opera, The Marriage of Figaro, Mozart actually used a lot of Masonic symbols and imagery. And there's a conspiracy theory that says the Masons actually had him killed for giving away secrets. Not true. Mozart died of scarlet fever, I believe. Church music. He wrote 17 masses. As I said, the greatest masses, his Mass in C minor, also his Coronation Mass, his Ave Verum Corpus, and then his Requiem, the final piece in the Kerschel catalog, probably the final piece he wrote. He died before he finished it. Initially, the initial completion of it was done by his pupil, Franz Xavier Süssmayr. Mozart's widow, Constanze, actually gave the music to Süssmayr and said, hey, can you finish this? Since then, other people have done their own realizations of Mozart's sketches and finished it themselves. They feel that Süssmayr didn't do a very good job of it. It was commissioned by a member of the nobility, anonymously in 1791. The story is that Count Walsegg actually intended to get the music from Mozart, and then after Mozart died, passed the music off as his own, saying that he wrote it. But Mozart died before he finished it. So, Chapter 23, Haydn and Mozart. They are the cores of the classical repertoire along with Beethoven. They were strong influences on Beethoven, and they've been massive influences on all classical music since then. So you can't really talk about Western classical music without talking about Haydn and Mozart, and their music has been in the repertoire since the day they died. These are some of the... There are composers before them whose music continued to be performed, but really starting with Haydn and Mozart, their music has never not been in the repertoire.